For survival horror fans last year, Resident Evil Village was probably the most anticipated game of 2021. This was very much the case for me after witnessing the teaser for the game back in 2020, and having to wait near enough a year to get my hands on the full game was painful to say the least. And yet here we are, a year after Village's release. The 4-year gap between Biohazard's release and before Village's release was a time of uncertainty. Uncertainty in the sense that no one really knew where the franchise would go next. For a long time it seemed like Capcom was hyper-focused on remaking older games in the franchise before it could be moved forward. Although these games were enjoyable, we all wanted that next installment that would progress the present story. People were interested to see where the characters would end up next. Luckily, Village was finally released to satisfy this hunger. Ethan was once again front and centre in a survival horror situation, fighting for his life against werewolves, vampires, Magneto, and his new best friend Chris, in order to find his daughter Rose. People have had plenty of time to let the contents of the game sink in and give their honest opinions on the final product. Many people have aired their criticisms about the game, and rightfully so. Not everyone feels the same way about every video game out there. We all have those opinions that others just can't grasp. I, for example, believe Gears of War has a better soundtrack than Halo. Yep, that definitely made a lot of people mad. There is no denying that Village has its problems, but the game is ultimately a success in the survival horror genre, shown by the 5.7 million copies sold as of January 2022. When the game was initially released in May of 2021, I beat the game in its entirety on the day of release, and as I came to the end of the game, I felt a mixture of emotions bubbling within me. Whilst I loved many of the game's features, some of them also really left a sour taste in my mouth. Maybe that's because I had the ingenious idea of beating the game in one sitting to avoid spoilers, which meant by the end of the game I was completely delirious from a lack of sleep. Whilst it is clear that Village takes a lot of inspiration from Resident Evil 4 in both its setting and gameplay mechanics, it feels like Village takes inspiration from more games in the series than just 4. Now that the game has been out for a whole year, and the gold edition for the game has just been announced, I thought it would be interesting to revisit the game from the beginning, replaying it all the way through and seeing if my opinion on it has changed in any way. Will I love it even more, or will I end up hating it? Who knows? Well, I know because I made this video, and you all know because you are watching the video, so you know what, let's just carry on. Village's story takes place 3 years after the events of Biohazard, continuing the story of Ethan Winters and his wife Mia as they try to settle into their new lives, living somewhere in Europe with their baby Rose, all the while trying to forget their time in the company of the Baker family. Of course, Resident Evil isn't full of sunshine and rainbows, so things take a turn for the worse when our boy Chris decides Ethan would be much better suited for his sister Claire. The sheer shock of seeing Chris, a long-time hero in the Resident Evil universe, gun down one of the main characters in the first 5 minutes was truly shocking to witness and completely caught me off guard. Well, that's what I would have said if Capcom didn't include that moment in the trailer. This moment was definitely made a lot less powerful due to the fact that it was shown in the trailers, and the fact that Chris's betrayal, in the biggest quotations ever, is shown to us in such great detail throughout the promotional material. Pretty much said to everyone, yeah, don't worry, this isn't important, he's not actually evil. We all knew at this point that Chris wasn't really bad, because if they actually spoiled something that big in the trailers, people would have lost their minds. Imagine how better it would have been if Chris wasn't actually shown in the promotional material, if the first time we saw him at all in Village was at this very moment, thinking he's there to help, and then all of a sudden, he shoots Mia. This would have been such a better thing to do, as it would have actually made us think, oh shit, maybe Chris is evil, or at the very least under some sort of control, like Jill was in Resident Evil 5. I mean, deep down, we all knew Chris wasn't evil, but having it in the trailer pretty much confirmed this, making it a massively wasted opportunity. After this confrontation, Ethan and Rose are taken and transported away from their home. The convoy taking them away is ambushed, and so Ethan's new quest is to find Rose by uncovering the mystery of a remote village he stumbles upon and defeating many of the less than friendly residents. I guess you could say these residents are evil. Village very much takes inspiration from Biohazard by having a loved one of Ethan's being kidnapped, causing him to put his life in danger to look for them, and whilst that could have been seen as lazy, I think the idea works a lot better here. Whilst I was never entirely sold on the relationship between Mia and Ethan, Ethan seems to genuinely care about his daughter. It comes to Ethan's attention that Mother Miranda, a godlike figure in the village who is viewed as the protector of its people, is actually pretty evil, and for some reason her and her children want Rose. The narrative of Village is not a complex one. Like I said earlier, it very much takes the same sort of ideas from Biohazard. Although I am a fan of the story, after playing it again I realised just how much the game relies on plot twists. Seriously, there are so many in this game that I'm sure even M. Night Shyamalan thought there were too many. The narratives of Resident Evil games have never been that complex. Most of them boil down to saving the world or someone close to the main character, and Village is no different, but the overabundance of plot twists really makes it feel like Capcom wanted this to be the most story-driven game to date, but honestly it just feels like all the rest. The twist that Mother Miranda had been spying on Ethan for some time could have been such a great twist if it was revealed in a better way, instead of having Chris reveal it to Ethan in a half-arsed way like he did. Having Miranda change in front of Ethan would have been so much better if this interaction between Chris and Ethan didn't happen. But the narrative works in such a way that this kind of needs to happen, as Chris gives Ethan the tools to fight Heisenberg, and of course Ethan is eventually killed by Miranda. The one twist that I genuinely enjoyed and made Ethan a somewhat interesting character was the reveal that he was made of mold and had been killed by Jack Baker in Biohazard all those years ago. This was without a doubt the best twist in the story, as it made sense and wasn't completely ruined by the trailers. This was also cleverly hinted at throughout the game, as no matter how much damage Ethan took, as long as he had a couple of drops of magic juice, he was good to go. Ultimately, the story is about parenthood and the sacrifices a person may make to keep those they love around, even if that means chopping up a baby and putting it in a jam jar. Whilst in my opinion Ethan is possibly the blandest protagonist seen in gaming since the generic soldier guy in front of most Call of Duty covers, the antagonists of this game are some of the best in the franchise. Like any typical mastermind, Miranda has her own set of underlings to carry out her bidding, so instead of dealing with Ethan, she gets her children to do it for her. Lady Dimitrescu, Heisenberg, Moreau, and Donna/Angie are the children of Miranda, not biologically, but in the sense that she created them in experiments, transforming them into beings with extraordinarily dangerous abilities, and making them lords over the small mountain village and the surrounding areas. By now, everyone knows that the internet has picked their favourites of the four, based on no particular reason. These characters add so much to the game, and honestly carry the pretty mediocre story. Without these characters, I'm certain Village wouldn't have been as good as it was. Without the likes of Heisenberg and Dimitrescu, who would the internet be able to jack off to? Mia? No thank you. Dimitrescu and Heisenberg are arguably the most interesting antagonists in Resident Evil Village, along with Mother Miranda. The difference in quality is so obvious between Dimitrescu and Heisenberg and Donna and Moreau. Dimitrescu and Heisenberg are given ample time to be fleshed out throughout the story, but it feels as though Donna's and Moreau's segments were cut too short. It's a shame too, as Donna's segment was arguably the scariest part of the game, and it would have been cool to get some more stuff like this. It definitely felt PT-esque, and had Donna's segment been longer, we could have gotten a chance to actually understand her character. I also kind of feel the same way about Moreau. Whilst Moreau's segment was a lot more engaging and interesting, we still did not learn much about his character, besides from him being hated by the other lords, and yearning for Mother Miranda's love. The point I'm making with these guys is that they have some great qualities, but ultimately missed the mark, thanks to Capcom placing all the focus on Mummy and Daddy. And even then, Heisenberg is utilised much more throughout the story than Dimitrescu. Whilst the lords were a great addition to the game, and great Resident Evil villains all around, they could have been so much better. After my first playthrough of the game, I was pretty indifferent to Mother Miranda. The idea that she had been Mia in disguise was a pretty neat twist, but again, the fact that Capcom showed Chris capping Mia in the face in the trailer made it seem like something wasn't quite right, as if they would just kill off a protagonist just like that. Seems like they didn't learn from Jill's death back in Resident Evil 5. It wasn't until replaying it for this video that I began to find her a lot more interesting, and now I see her as just as integral to the game's success as Dimitrescu and Heisenberg. Most villains in Resident Evil are not relatable in the slightest. Most of them are just the typical baddie trope of being mad with power and wanting to take over the world, but this perception of what a Resident Evil villain could be has definitely shifted over the years. Resident Evil 7 was the game to show us this, as for once the villains of the game weren't power-hungry sociopaths, but victims who had no control over their actions, as they were manipulated and changed by a little girl who just wanted a family of her own. Village continued this sympathetic villain trend with Mother Miranda, and although you could argue that she is pure evil, which, I mean she is, the reason for her becoming evil is a lot more interesting and heartbreaking. Miranda's daughter, Eva, died nearly 100 years before the events of Resident Evil Village due to the Spanish flu pandemic, and after coming into contact with the mold, devoted her life to experimenting with the parasite in order to bring her daughter back to life, which ultimately led to the creation of the horrors encountered throughout the village, including her pseudo-children. Having a villain who just wanted her child back helped bring some emotion to the story, which was great in a franchise where the story is never that heartfelt or interesting. Although the story isn't perfect, it feels a lot more personal thanks to moments like this. The villains of Village were arguably some of the most memorable parts of the game, but of course you can't have a Resident Evil game without protagonists, and this game includes without a doubt the chattiest protagonist in Resident Evil, Chris Redfield. I'm a huge fan of Chris, and seeing him again in Village was great, and it was nice to see that Chris was back to his dumb persona I fell in love with in Resident Evil 5. Although Chris does come across as a badass in this game thanks to his sick, edgy design, Capcom still found a way to make him seem stupid. The fact that Chris does not inform Ethan of his plan right away and instead opt for coming across as a villain really didn't make sense, and more or or less just acted as a cheap way to make the player think Chris had changed allegiances, which people were never going to believe, let's be honest. The game even seems to point out how dumb this plan was when one of Chris's soldiers tells him how stupid of an idea that was.
I know it's too late now, but we really should have told Ethan the plan.
There wasn't time. We didn't expect Miranda to act so soon.
Even so, you should have told him.
Yeah.
Yeah, great job, game. Telling yourself how stupid you are. So meta. I know it kind of had to happen like this in order for the story to go where it did, but everyone and myself knows the story has its issues, and this is one of the reasons why. Whilst Chris was flawed, his portrayal wasn't bad, but Ethan, on the other hand, was a bit of a different story. Ethan Winters might just be one of the most polarizing characters in recent Resident Evil. The world was introduced to Ethan during the events of Resident Evil 7, and most people found him pretty mediocre at best. But despite him coming across as just a typical default skin, there was something interesting about just having a regular person in one of these situations. For years, fans were used to seeing the same reoccurring, badass, testosterone-filled protagonists wiping the floor with bioweapons, so playing as some random clueless dude was a huge departure from the norm, but obviously it worked so well in the game's setting and tone. Whilst Ethan was never the most interesting character ever created, having him return for another game meant Capcom could flesh out his character instead of having him driven by Mia's pussy, like in the last game. Whilst the game did give more character to Ethan, he is arguably the most inconsistent and bizarre protagonist created in the series. Personality-wise, Ethan is all over the place in Village, and his reactions to situations range from believable to laughable.
Dead body? Wait, there's more.
This sounds like a really bad thing, making a character feel so inconsistent, but if I'm being honest, this was one of the things that I liked about Ethan in this game. We know that dialogue writing isn't at its best in Resident Evil, as cheese often runs rampant throughout dialogue. Village without a doubt is one of the campiest games in the series with its dialogue, and most of this cheesy dialogue is given to Ethan. Now, I'm not slating Todd solely here. A lot of the lines he delivers are fantastic, and that ending segment when Ethan says goodbye to Rose still makes me sad a year later, but some of these lines really do stick out. There are several instances where Ethan's emotions really don't seem to match what is actually happening. The first, biggest example comes from when Ethan believes Mia, his beloved wife, had just been murdered by the hands of his friend Chris, and rather than be completely distraught by the whole experience, it seems to be more of an annoyance to him. Chris, come on buddy, we just had the carpet cleaned. This becomes even more jarring when Ethan gets so upset by the death of someone he knew for about 5 minutes. The issue here isn't really the actor, but rather the directing, as surely the director for the game should have been able to realise how bizarre these reactions are. There are plenty of moments throughout the game that just feel off tonally, and whilst this makes many of these interactions funny, this is kind of a bad thing when the game is trying to be scary. Side characters also play a huge role in making Village as immersive and atmospheric as possible, and whilst they vary in terms of importance and screen time, the majority of them serve their purpose very well. The standout ones for me at least are of course Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela, the daughters of Dimitrescu, and of course Duke. The sisters create a very conflicting feeling within the player, as despite posing a threat around Castle Dimitrescu, the player often thinks twice about running away from them. Or maybe that's just me. Duke is arguably the most interesting and important side character in the game, as he guides Ethan on his journey to retrieve Rose, and is shrouded in so much mystery that you can't help but be intrigued by this kind and yet otherworldly being. My opinions on these characters haven't really changed at all besides Miranda. I still think Elena was severely underused, and I still don't really like Mia, so let's just move on. Village very much continues with the new approach to gameplay Biohazard introduced in 2017. However, the experience definitely feels more like a hybrid of many other past Resident Evil games. The first-person view once again creates a claustrophobic and personal experience for the player, letting you take in every inch of the brand new environments Village has to offer. Resident Evil 8 is a survival horror game through and through, including plenty of gameplay mechanics fans have become familiar with over the years. It would be easy to sit here and say that Village just copied what Resident Evil 7 did. Even a year ago, I didn't believe that was the case. Resident Evil Village has some of the most satisfying and engaging gameplay seen in the franchise for a long time. As well as working on making the combat more fluid and varied, I was happy to see puzzles once again be a huge part of a Resident Evil game. Honestly, after how the RE3 remake turned out with the lack of puzzles, I was skeptical as to whether Village would include many puzzles in the gameplay. Although there aren't so many to the point where Village starts to feel like a classic Resident Evil game, there are enough of them sprinkled throughout to break up the combat segments, making neither sides of the gameplay as tiresome as they could have been. Whilst the combat is not the most robust or exciting we have ever seen, it is very much an improvement from the fairly slow and at times clunky combat we saw in Biohazard. It's hard to explain exactly, as both games look pretty identical, but something has definitely been tweaked to make it more enjoyable, striking a fairly healthy balance between action and survival horror. A major factor as to why the combat in Village is a lot funner is definitely down to the enemy variety. Although some of the creatures in this game are not the most unique we've seen in the franchise, they are a lot more interesting to fight than Gloopy Monster, Big Gloopy Monster, and Crawling Gloopy Monster. Most of the enemies you will be fighting are made up of fairly weak underlings created for the sole purpose of serving the Lords and Mother Miranda. You encounter these enemies throughout most of the areas in the game, and although they are frail, they are dangerous in large numbers. These creatures are only a glimpse of what the mold can really create. The monsters in Village vary in size and durability, meaning not all of them can be taken out by just a couple of bullets. Most new areas typically harbour new enemies, meaning the player is always having to keep their guard up for what comes next. It also encourages the player to experiment with their arsenal of weapons, seeing which weapon works best for which enemy. To say Resident Evil Village took inspiration from Resident Evil 4 would be an understatement. Many elements from 4's gameplay that were introduced in that game are brought over to this game. The number of weapons and tools at Ethan's disposal has been significantly increased, allowing you to try out a variety of weapons and find out exactly which ones you enjoy using the most. This again has to do with enemy variety, as certain weapons work better on specific enemies. This was the biggest departure from recent Resident Evil, as Village reintroduces the idea of being able to buy equipment and resources. Throughout the game, Duke can be found in numerous locations as you progress, which is pretty crazy considering his stature. Maybe he has a mobility scooter in his carriage. When visiting Duke, Ethan is able to purchase weapons, upgrades for the weapons, ammo blueprints, and healing items. All very useful stuff that is integral to your survival, unless you're one of those nerds who completed the game with a knife only. Most of this stuff was available in Resident Evil 4 and 5. You know, buying weapons and healing items is standard stuff at this point. But one very interesting addition was being able to have Duke cook meals for you. Increasing your base stats was something introduced in Resident Evil 7, with Ethan being able to find steroids that increase his base health and shrink his balls. With all the steroids he took in Biohazard, it's a miracle Rose was conceived, honestly. Being able to upgrade the stats of the character you were playing was a cool concept, and Village decided to take it a step further and make it more interesting than putting a dirty needle in your arm. Duke gives you a list of meals that he can prepare for you, and when eaten, grant Ethan permanently increased attributes like increased health and running speed. In order to make these 5-star meals, you have to find and kill animals scattered around the village. However, there are also meals Duke can make that require more sophisticated ingredients. These rare ingredients can only be obtained by killing rare animals hidden in secret locations around the village. For me, RE8 has one of the most unique map designs in the series. The game for the most part very much feels like a semi-open world game, as you are able to freely explore several parts of the village and the surrounding areas. The main village area kind of acts like a hub world for the game, as you constantly have to travel through it in order to get to other locations of the game. Having to pass back through familiar locations may make some people feel like they aren't making any progress, but I actually really enjoyed this aspect of the game. Village for me offers the most replayability in the franchise since 4, as there are many hidden locations that harbour treasures, weapons, and, like I mentioned earlier, rare animals. Having these extra little elements to the game makes the world feel so much more alive and strange, and it doesn't feel like a forced inclusion there to frustrate the player, but rather it encourages them to see what other secrets the village holds. Not many Resident Evil games of the past have put quite as much side content in that makes you want to explore the entirety of the space the player is allowed to interact with. Despite having so many ideas and mechanics from other Resident Evil games, Village still feels like a unique Resident Evil experience. Back when the game first came out, honestly I didn't really enjoy the combat side of the game all that much. I don't know why, but to me, as the game progressed, the combat started to feel tedious, which was very noticeable when puzzle solving became less frequent. However, after I replayed it, I could see that this was a step in the right direction from Biohazard. It's not perfect, but there's a lot of variety there that helps make it fun. Resident Evil Village is an effective survival horror game. It has all the elements necessary to help capture the panic one feels when running low on supplies, whilst being cornered by enemies. After my first time beating the game, I found that the game wasn't really that scary, and once I replayed it again, I was certain of this. Resident Evil Village has moments in it that are just downright freaky, and there are times in the game where the scary atmosphere is executed perfectly. These moments aren't very frequent, however, and fizzle out as the game goes on. This is one of the elements where I thought the franchise took a step back, I feel. Resident Evil 7 truly felt like a horror game. The atmosphere was foreboding, and you were genuinely scared to see what the bakers had in store next. This was because Resident Evil 7 kept a lot of things in the dark, both figuratively and literally. Although yes, the game does stop being scary after a time, Village's scares begin to wear off much sooner than Biohazard's. If I was to look at this game from a horror fan perspective, there are only 2 moments where Village feels like it fully embraces its horror lineage, these being the first 1 to 2 hours of the game, and the other being Donna's mansion. The first hour of this game for me is so effective at creating this sense of dread and fear in the player, as like Ethan, you are thrown into this new world of uncertainty and new creatures you have never faced before. Stumbling through the mountain range in the pitch black whilst unknown creatures scurry and run beside you was enough to make anyone feel uneasy, and once you finally reach the village, you think, damn, this place is creepy as shit. For a while, this is the case, as you stumble from one place to the next, barely surviving encounters with demonic beings with powers never seen before in Resident Evil. This sets up Village to be one of the scariest games in the series. Whilst the game is immersive with its gorgeous yet creepy locales, that initial fear you had disappears alarmingly quickly. What I find with most effective scary Resident Evil games is that although there is eventually a dip in fear factor, there are moments throughout these games that remind you that you are playing a horror game. Resident Evil 4 again is not the scariest game in the franchise, but one that is much scarier than Village thanks to those short segments that teach you not to get too complacent. Resident Evil Nemesis for me is probably one of the scarier games in the series, thanks to Nemesis alone, and the original Resident Evil remake continues a steady feeling of horror and dread within the player thanks to its visual design, monsters, difficulty, and soundtrack. I've already said Village is visually gorgeous, from the rotten wooden huts of the village to the prestigious castle of Dimitrescu, but they don't generate a lot of fear within you. I think the biggest reason for this, without a doubt, is the lighting in this game. To put it simply, the game is too bright. Having the first hour of the game be in the middle of the day or early morning makes sense, as you want to introduce the player to the rules of the game without scaring them too much. Resident Evil 4 did this perfectly by having the game during the beginning be set in the day, then once the game hits the 2-hour mark, it gets darker and more intense. This is what Village should have done. Once you kill Dimitrescu and head back to the village, it should have started to go darker, which would have caused the player to be more cautious. Too often I found myself rushing through the village because I felt too comfortable with it being bright outside. How much more effective would the introduction to the huge werewolf have been if it attacked you in the dark? This would have been a moment that stuck with you after playing, but the fact that you can just easily avoid it because you can quickly map out your route nullified the experience. Although the sun does eventually piss off, you only get to play the game in the dark during 2 of arguably the least scary segments in the game, the fight with Optimus Prime and the part where you take out the entire Lycan army as Chris. The point I'm trying to make is that Village had the potential to arguably be the scariest game in the series. The gothic setting was perfect, and the fact that the enemies were based off of classic movie monsters and gothic folklore meant this game could have been a terrifying journey from beginning to end, but sadly this wasn't a priority. Of course, all horror is subjective, so maybe there were those people who got scared by Iron Giant. After my last playthrough of Village, I found myself appreciating the game more than I did when it first came out. Whilst I was kind of disappointed by the horror aspects of the game, and I still am, Resident Evil 8 is still a great game, in my opinion. The characters, the setting, the gameplay, and Mummy D all make Village a great Resident Evil experience. Although some elements really could have been executed a lot better, all in all, Village succeeded in delivering a satisfying and entertaining experience, and now that the DLC has been revealed, I can't wait to step into this world once again.